I've spent a great deal of my life listening to, practicing, writing, and performing music. I've put myself through 2 degrees, worked with around a dozen teachers, and tried every method I could get my hands on to quote unquote learn music. Playing jazz music in particular, I felt an immense pressure to have a huge repertoire of tunes in multiple keys, have expansive and hip improvisational language, and have total technical mastery over my instrument. I spent around 3 to 4 hours in a practice room for years, hardly accomplishing any of those feats that I sought after. This led to panic attacks, depressive episodes, and a stint of burnout throughout my early 20s. But over the past few years, I've experienced somewhat of an unwinding, a gentler approach to both myself and my music. And in this more calm practice, I've found a great deal of progress, actually, even more than I was able to find while attending music conservatory. What I've discovered is that learning isn't a process of simply intaking a bunch of information, especially with music. More so, the best musicians learn to be musical through a process called audiation. In the 1970s, a researcher named Edwin Gordon conducted research on things like musical aptitude, memory, and ultimately how a person learns music. Throughout the decade, Gordon published a handful of influential papers, including his seminal 1980 book, Learning Sequences in Music, Skill, Content, and Patterns. And this work was the first to formalize the idea of audiation, a process in which one hears and comprehends music when the sound of the music is not physically present. When I was taking jazz theory classes as an undergrad student, the professor I had would often refer to the mind's ear, which I believe was essentially referring to the same concept. Now, this theory is largely applied to early childhood music teaching, but the practice of audiation is something that most people do naturally. If I simply mention the name Mary Had a Little Lamb, the melody likely starts to sound in your head. And this is audiation. The reason that most people can sit down at the piano and plunk out that tune, even with very little musical knowledge. Essentially, our brains have taken abstract vibrations processed by proprioceptors in our ears and bodies, organized them into patterns and sequences, and formed them into long-term musical memories that we can in turn reproduce. In essence, audiation is not about learning music, but rather training our ear, brain, and body to simply be musical. At this point, you're probably tired of my personal stories and academic jargon and hoping to uncover how to deepen your mind's ear and progress towards your own musical goals. So here are some concise ideas on practicing mixed with some helpful affirmations to guide you through this process. Number 1, sing everything you play. Every musician is a singer. That's an adage that makes a ton of musicians kind of clam up. Truthfully, no one is expecting you to sing like a professional, but you are robbing yourself of the best way to train your ear to recognize patterns, melodies, and chord tones. As instrumentalists especially, we have dissociation built into our practice. When I was first transcribing jazz solos, I remember looping a particular Sonny Stitt line. And after a while, I began thinking about the classes I still had to finish work for and like what I wanted for dinner. And I essentially lost that valuable practice time. I was just going through the motions. But when I began to sing my transcriptions, I began to hear the precise notes and rhythms so much clearer. So when you sing, you just engage a much more active music process in your brain. If singing is something that you're not familiar with or frustrated by, I would like you to remind yourself that music is as old as humanity is, and that we only began writing down music in around 1400 BC. So this oral tradition is really much more in our DNA. Number 2, put rhythms in your body. If the adage about singers made you climb up, this may make you run for the hills. Every musician is a drummer, and every drummer is a dancer. Part of our proprioception, those electrical signals sent from our ear and body to our brain, involves feeling music, and coordinating rhythms. If this also makes you a bit nervous, please remind yourself that while our ancestors sang, they danced and drummed. So this too is very deeply ingrained in our DNA. Number 3, practice small, steady, and sustained. Let's start with practicing small. When you're working on a piece of music, break it into small and logical chunks. This could be melodic fragments, single chords of groups of 2 chords, cadences, or whatever may be practical to you in the moment. If it feels like you're not covering enough ground, remind yourself that it is more valuable to master a single phrase than to merely survive a larger piece. Practice steady. Work on this as slow as possible to get every note accurate with consistent tone and time. And remind yourself that practicing slow does not mean you are incapable of practicing fast, or playing fast, rather. But it means that you are patient with yourself and willing to let yourself learn new material. Practice sustained. Once you have a small fragment to practice and a steady pace to play it, repeat it for a sustained period of time. I'm a big fan of what people call the Pomodoro technique, which is 25 minutes of focus practice mixed with 5-minute breaks. You'll find more often than not that by the time you arrive at the 5-minute break, the fragment will be smooth and heading closer to that effortless execution that we strive for. Remind yourself, as a child, you learn to speak through repetition. Remember that music is just another language you can become fluent in by the same means. In finishing this piece, I want to share a clip of the late pianist Vladimir Horowitz. This clip was taken from a documentary made about a 1980s recital recorded on Horowitz's home piano. In this fragment, Horowitz was asked about Sergei Rachmaninoff, to which he responds with some very charming personal anecdotes and also a fragment of Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto. As you watch, imagine knowing something so deeply that you can sit down with your instrument and allow it to pour out of you like an old memory. That's kind of what I'm getting at here.
Rachmaninoff is a pianist. He was a wonderful pianist and a nice friend. He was my best friend. First of all, he was composer, pianist, and conductor. 3 things at once, and first class all 3. I think so. Still, his concerts he played, he still played.
And he was a wonderful person. There was a man in the grand style.
If you stuck around this late into the video, I thank you dearly for watching my work. This is the first in a long venture, or at least what I hope is a long venture of educational materials. If you want to support me here on YouTube, you can go ahead and subscribe to my channel and like and comment and do all those fun things. And if you want to go a little bit deeper, you can go into my description and get linked to my Substack, where I do a somewhat regular newsletter and provide complimentary resources to go along with things like my YouTube videos here. There is a free tier in which you can access everything. I will not paywall post because information should be for everybody. But if you also want to support me, there are a few tiers available for that as well.